Okay, this video will be for the Hong Kong seam finish. So I've got my two rectangles already sewn together. I'm sewing this on the same sample as I did the bound. So I've just got my other seam allowance singled out, ready to stitch the Hong Kong onto. For this one, you'll also need a bias strip. So that's the pattern we used for the bound. Make sure that you put that green line parallel to your selvage when you cut it out. Okay, this one is going to begin with your seam allowance singled out, laying face up right now, and I'm going to put my bias strip face down and match up the raw edge right there. So it should be covering up the rest of your seam allowance, and from the back that's what it's looking like. So pin that on, match up that raw edge here. Excuse me. Excuse me, and pin. We're going to stitch that together at 1/4 inch. Okay, so this is what we're looking like right now, from the front, from the back. And now I'm going to head over and start pressing this. Okay, so taking it from where we've got it and we just stitched it, I'm going to flip out this bias strip that's sitting on top. So flip it towards the outside, leaving my other seam allowance still folded back. And then I'm going to lay that face down on the ironing board. And I'm going to bust open those two seam allowances that we just stitched, so that I get that nice flat seam on the other side. Now both of those seam allowances are going to get pressed towards the bias strip. So I'm going to flip that top one back to the bias strip and press. Okay, so this is what we're looking like at the moment. Now I'm going to take this raw edge of the bias strip up here, fold it down so that it meets right in the middle with where those other two seam allowances are, and press. Now I'm going to fold right where those two are meeting, fold this bias strip down so that it just barely covers up that stitch line, that first top stitch line. Again, press this really well so that it doesn't pop up on you as you're trying to sew. Let it cool flat. You may put something on top of it and give it a minute to cool while it's flat. Little part of mine didn't quite reach that stitch line, so I'm gonna just fix that right now. Okay, now we're ready to go pin and stitch this. The most efficient way to pin this is going to be to put your pin through the seam on the front and make sure in the back that it's coming out through the strip. It should be catching the strip. The reason for that is that we're about to do what's called a stitch in the ditch. This is the first time that we've done this. And the ditch in this case is the seam. And you will be stitching right through that seam line that we started with in the front to catch the back of the strip. So that's why I've got to make sure that when we put our pin through that it catches the back. That'll tell us when our needle goes through, it'll do the same. And this should be essentially an invisible stitch by the end of it. That stitch line, especially if it was matching, if your thread was matching the color of your fabric, that stitch line would blend right into your seam and wouldn't be noticeable. Okay, so I've got that fully pinned in the ditch on the front, catching the strip in the back. And now we're ready to stitch in the ditch. When I line this up on my machine, I want my needle to be lined right up with that seam. So I can actually lift up my foot and put my needle down first. Rotate your needle so it's down into the fabric, going right through the center of that seam line. That way I know I'm starting in the exact right spot. Then start with your back stitch and follow down that seam line. Take it nice and slow so that you can control where that needle is going. Okay, so from the front, your seam should be hidden right, or your stitch line should be hidden right in that seam. And from the back, it should look like an edge stitch. That is the Hong Kong. Again, if you have a little bit sticking off at the end, you can snip that off. But if it's more than a quarter, you need to recut and redo because your strip stretched out too much. That is a tongue twister.